Hey everybody, Jeff from Corrugated Cavalier here, doing another installment of Beer with the Cavalier. It's been a while, so I figured I would get into this a little bit. So I'm going to do two videos. I recently made two English beers from roughly World War I period. This one is just before. And I'm going to include some swords, since this is a sword channel, so some swords, some British military swords of World War I as well. So this first beer is a 1913 Adnams BLB. It's basically a bitter, if you're familiar with that term. If you're not, it's I don't know, kind of just like a somewhat basic pale ale is kind of what I would say for Americans not familiar with that term. So Adnams Brewery was is in Southwold, England, and they claim that beer has been brewed there since 1345 by an alewife named Joanna de Corby. So we're just going to go through a little bit more of the history of that brewery, Adnams. In 1818, there was a hotel named the Swan, and it was bought by Thomas Buchanan. And to help pay for it, he sold off the attached brew house to the hotel to maltster William Crisp. And actually, Crisp Malts is still around today. You can kind of see up here this malt bag is a William Crisp malt bag, and that is also the malt that was used in brewing this. I don't know for sure if it was at the time in 1913 when this was brewed or not, no clue, but that's what I used to make this beer. In 1872, brothers George and Ernest Adnams bought the brewery that was originally sold to William Crisp. In 1880, George went down to South Africa, and just a fun little tidbit, he was apparently eaten by a crocodile. I didn't dig too much into that one. But sure, why not? In 1890, Adnams and Company was established, and they're still in Southwold today. So about this particular beer, the 1913 Adnams BLB, it is made with pale malt, flaked maize, and invert sugar, and that is a very typical grain bill of the time. And invert sugar, if you're not familiar, is basically unrefined sugar that you boil with some food-grade acid to darken the color, as well as bring some flavor as well. The one that I made with this, I may have made it a little bit too dark, and that may have changed the color a little bit, but not significantly. Still pretty nice color for my taste anyhow. Oh yeah, there we go. Got thirsty. Earlier recipes often use United States malts, not entirely, but in part, or European continental malts. Getting toward World War I time, that they didn't really do that. The hops used in the original recipe were Fuggles, East Kent Golding, and Saz from the Czech Republic. I didn't use Fuggles because I was all out, but that was the bittering hop, and not much flavor or aroma really stays from the bittering hop, so I used Challenger, which is another UK hop. I did use East Kent Goldings, where it says in the recipe, and instead of Saz, I use Polish Lubelski. It's not exactly the same, but I had it around, and it's a fairly similar profile. So I went with Polish Lubelski instead. There's a pretty decent dry hop compared to the original Gravity, or how strong the beer might end up. And that original Gravity is 1.044. I didn't end up exactly on that when I brewed it, but I adjusted it to make it that. Gravities did begin to be limited by the government, just because to up the gravity, you need more fermentable material, which basically means grain. They started limiting the gravities in 1917, which apparently did not affect the rural brewers as much. So says Ron Pattinson in this book, Let's Brew, which is fantastic if you're into this sort of thing. Ron Pattinson, that's where I got this recipe from. Yeah. So this was still not limited. This was just before the war, the eve of World War I, 1913. So he says in this book, BLB didn't survive the war. My last sighting of it is in December of 1916, when it still had a respectable OG, that's an original gravity, of 1.042. In 1917, its replacement, simply called PA, or probably Pale Ale, was just 1.032 original gravity, so that's quite a drop. Once again, that's from Let's Brew by Ron Pattinson. Great stuff. You can also check out his blog, Shut Up About Barclay Perkins. He is a wealth of information on these topics, if you're into that. So the tasting notes on this, you do get some malt presence. It's not huge, but you get some malt presence. As far as the hop character, there is a little bit of a spicy floral thing going on, but I almost get like, I want to say citrus, but not like straight like bursting orange or anything like that. It's more of like a citrus like peel or marmalade or jam or like preserves or something like that, which I actually kind of prefer. It's a little bit more of a complex flavor for me. And there is a nice bitterness there. It's not overwhelming, but there's a nice firm bitterness there that I really like. Kind of, you know, makes the palate want more of it, in my opinion. Yeah, so it's not, you know, a beer that's earth-shattering by any means, but it's a really, really nice drinker with a certain amount of complexity. And, you know, while my beer, I'm sure, is not exactly the same as the historical example, it's kind of nice thinking that, you know, back in World War I, I just made something that they were drinking something probably relatively close to. I don't have a caste system. Don't hate on me if you're a British beer purist. Okay, so on to the sword part of this. Hopefully, you know, if some of you are waiting for it, that's this part. So I'm going to talk about the 1897 infantry officer's sword. And I've got my very much not 1897 infantry officer's sword here, but just for demonstration purposes. This is a Purple Heart Armory Spadroon trainer. Liking it so far. I'll do more on that later in another video. So a lot of people think that this pattern was solely for thrusting. If you look at it, it does look like a thrusting blade. It's straight, it only has an edge on the last half, and it has rounded edges for strength and stability and a fuller. It is primarily a thrusting sword, but the 1895, I'm sorry, Infantry Sword Exercises manual. Sorry, I'm going to just look that up real quick. Infantry Sword Exercise by Maestro Ferdinand Masiello of Florence, contracted by the British government, of course, does feature quite a few cuts as well. And Matt Easton has a lot of great videos on this, and you know, he kind of comes to the conclusion that especially if you got the last half where it does have an edge, like sharpened, you could cut with it. It's not primarily for that, but you certainly could. The 1897 started originally with like a complex, what they called Gothic Hilts, made of brass. That went through a couple of changes to be steel and have smaller holes, basically, for various reasons. I don't want to get too much into it. It was carried in the South African War in 1899. As far as its World War I use, on August 6th, 1914, the sharpened swords order was given to officers, which means get ready for combat, basically, and it is still used as the dress infantry officer's sword for the British military. Eventually, they were ordered to turn in their swords for swagger sticks, and most people will say, well, that's because, you know, swords weren't viable fighting weapons anymore. And while I think that certainly has something to do with it, there were plenty of hand weapons being used in trench combat. And I think Matt Easton makes a good point in another video that, especially if you had this unsheathed, or I mean, even if you didn't, it would still mark you out as an officer, but especially if you hadn't had it unsheathed. And for any marksman shooting long distance with rifle fire, if they see a sword in hand, it's like, well, that's an officer. And you know, the one theory is that it made them targets, basically. So the swagger sticks were not big shiny metal things, so they weren't as able to be targeted as easily, I suppose. It is a 32-inch blade made by the Wilkinson Sword Company of London, and it is just under 2 pounds, apparently. Royal Armories has a really great article on this. Like I said, Matt Easton has a lot of good videos on this. So if you want to check it out for the 1897 infantry officer's sword. Okay, I hope that was an interesting look at combining two of my favorite things anyways, beer and swords. I have another video of the 1915 Courage Double Stout, along with the cavalry sword at that time, so go ahead and check that out if you're interested in this kind of thing. Thanks for coming by the channel. Please click like, subscribe, share this around to people who might find it interesting. Follow me on Twitter at CorrugatedCaval1, and be good to each other. Cheers.